The wind rolled over the empty plains, carrying the soft rattle of dry grass and the faraway whistle of a train. It was the only sound that broke the silence of the lonely station. When the door opened, a woman stepped down, holding a small brown suitcase and a folded letter close to her chest. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the hope she carried. This was supposed to be the beginning of her new life. She had written so many letters, poured her heart into every line, and now, after weeks of waiting, she was finally here to meet the man who promised her a home, maybe even love. Her name was Clara. She wasn't young anymore, not by the world's standards. But her eyes still carried warmth, and her smile was soft, the kind that had learned both joy and pain. She scanned the faces waiting near the platform, her heart quickening as she spotted a man standing near the wagon. Tall, stiff, clean boots. That had to be him. She walked forward, shy but full of hope. When she said his name, he turned. For a long second he just looked at her. His eyes, once polite in letters, now seemed colder in person. He stepped closer, squinting, as if trying to find the woman from his imagination. Then his mouth pressed into a thin line. "You're older than I expected," he muttered. Clara froze. The station suddenly felt too quiet. She tried to laugh to soften the moment. "The light on the train was dim," she said, half joking, but he didn't smile. He just shook his head and turned away. People nearby pretended not to stare. The man spoke to the wagon driver, whispered something, and pointed back at her. The driver frowned, then walked over. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "he's not talking you. Says there's been a mistake." Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Just like that, the promise of a new life vanished into the dust. The train was gone, the sun already sinking behind the hills, and she stood there alone, too proud to cry, too tired to move. That's when she heard footsteps, slow, steady, coming from the other side of the platform. A voice followed, deep and calm, carrying warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Miss," it said gently, "don't mind him." She turned and saw the man who would change everything. Clara stood still, her suitcase resting by her feet, her heart caught between disbelief and shame. The man who had promised her a future was already gone, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and silence. She could feel eyes on her, pitying, curious, judgmental, but no one said a word. The train that had brought her here was long gone, and with it went her only way back. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond the promise written in that letter still folded in her trembling hand. The ink was smudged now from her grip, but she could still read the words, "I will be waiting for you at the station." He had waited, but only long enough to break her heart. She gathered her courage and started walking toward the small waiting shed near the tracks. The air was cooling fast. Night was falling over the open land. Her dress, once neat and pressed, now looked travel-worn. Dust clung to the hem, and her shoes, once black and shiny, had turned the color of the earth. She sat on a wooden bench and stared out at the fading sky, her mind replaying every choice that had brought her here. Maybe she should have never answered that newspaper ad. Maybe she should have stayed in the little sewing shop, stitching other people's dresses and dreams. Maybe love, for her, was a story that had already ended. But deep inside, she knew why she came. It wasn't foolishness, it was hope. A hope that someone somewhere would see her not for her years, but for her heart. That maybe, after a life of quiet work and long evenings alone, she might have found someone to talk to at supper, someone who'd ask how her day was. It wasn't too much to want. Or so she thought. The sky dimmed into a deep orange as the last light faded. One by one, the station workers left, until only she and the man sweeping near the ticket office remained. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The air smelled of dry grass and iron. Just as she began to think she'd have to sleep there, a low voice spoke behind her. "You look like you've come a long way." Clara turned. It was the same man she'd noticed earlier, the one standing by the fence, watching quietly when the rancher had turned her away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from years of working under the sun. His face was rough, not from neglect but from living close to the land. His hat was old, tilted low, but his eyes, clear and calm, held no judgment. "I have," she said softly. "Longer than I thought." He nodded once, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "You're waiting on someone?" Clara hesitated. The truth burned in her throat. "I was," she said finally. He changed his mind. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "People can be cruel in quiet ways," he said. "Name's Sam." "Clara," she replied, her voice faint. He nodded again. "Clara," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "That's a strong name." She gave a weak smile, unsure how to respond. He looked around, then gestured toward the horizon where the sun had slipped away completely. "It's a long walk to town from here. You got a place to stay?" Clara shook her head. "No, I thought," she paused, lowering her eyes. "I thought I'd have one waiting." Sam scratched the back of his neck, thinking. "There's a room at the inn, maybe. But it's 10 miles west. You won't make it by dark." "I'll be fine," she lied. He gave a small huff, part sigh, part disbelief. "Ma'am, you're not walking 10 miles alone in the dark. Coyotes'll smell a traveler before the moon's up." She blinked, unsure if she should feel insulted or comforted. "I'll stay at the station till morning." He glanced at the empty ticket window, the creaky benches, and the thin walls that wouldn't stop a strong wind, let alone a wild animal. "That ain't safe either." He paused, looking at her again, really looking this time. There was no pity in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "My ranch is a mile down that road," he said slowly. "You can stay in the guest cabin. It ain't fancy, but it's warm, and no one'll bother you there." Clara stared at him, surprised. "You don't even know me." He shrugged. "Don't need to, I just know no one deserves to be left like that." The words sank into her chest, heavier than she expected. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without a reason. She searched his face for some hidden motive, but found none. Just tired eyes and honest concern. She wanted to say no to keep her pride, but pride didn't keep you warm at night, and the cold was already creeping into her bones. "All right," she whispered. He nodded once and picked up her suitcase as if it weighed nothing. "Come on then, Clara. Let's get you out of this wind." They walked in silence down the dirt road, the stars slowly appearing overhead. Each step felt surreal to her, like walking out of a nightmare and into something uncertain but real. She glanced at him now and then, trying to read his thoughts. He didn't talk much, just led the way with calm, steady strides. When they reached his property, she saw a small house with a light flickering in the window and a barn nearby, quiet except for the soft lowing of cattle. He set her suitcase by the porch. "You'll stay in there," he said, nodding toward a small side cabin. "It's clean, got a stove and a cot. I'll bring some food." Clara looked around, overwhelmed. "You don't have to go through all this trouble." He smiled faintly. "Ain't trouble, it's just what folks should do." Something about the way he said it made her throat tighten again. She wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. He handed her a lantern instead. "There's matches inside," he said. "Rest tonight. We'll figure the rest in the morning." And with that, he turned and walked toward the main house, the sound of his boots fading into the night. Clara stood there for a long moment, holding the lantern, staring at the small cabin that suddenly felt like a miracle. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and warmth. She lit the stove, set down her suitcase, and sat on the cot. For the first time that day, she let herself breathe. Outside, the wind whispered across the fields, and somewhere in the dark, she heard Sam's dog bark once before settling again. She lay back on the thin pillow, her heart still unsure if this was kindness or fate. But as the light flickered across the wooden walls, one thought settled deep in her mind. Sometimes, what's meant for you doesn't arrive in the form you expected. Sometimes it arrives after the world tells you no. Morning came slowly, slipping through the cracks of the cabin walls in thin lines of gold. Clara woke to the sound of birds and the smell of something warm, coffee, maybe bread. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came back: the train, the rejection, the long walk, and the man with the calm voice who told her she didn't deserve that. She sat up, brushing her hair from her face. Her hands felt cold, but her heart, for the first time in days, didn't. Outside, the world looked endless. The sky stretched wide, soft blue above golden fields that shimmered in the light. She stepped out, careful on the wooden steps, and saw Sam by the barn already at work. His movements were steady, practiced, feeding the horses, checking fences, the rhythm of a man who'd lived the same morning 1,000 times. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, a silent good morning. She hesitated, then walked toward him. "You rise early," she said softly. He smiled barely. "Cows don't wait for sunlight." There was no awkwardness in his tone, just simple truth. He poured her a cup of coffee from a metal pot sitting on a barrel and handed it to her. It was strong and bitter, but she held it with both hands, letting the warmth sink in. "Thank you for last night," she said after a while. "I didn't mean to trouble you." Sam shook his head. "Wasn't trouble, you needed a place." "I had one." She looked down at the dirt between her boots. "You don't talk much, do you?" He chuckled softly. "Talkin' doesn't fix fences or calm horses. Never been much good with words." She smiled for the first time that morning. "Then maybe we'll get along just fine. I talk too much when I'm nervous." He looked at her again, studying her face, not in the way men sometimes did, but as if trying to see what kind of soul lived behind her eyes. "Nervous people are honest," he said. "They don't have time to pretend." That sentence lingered in the air between them. It wasn't flirtation, just truth, and somehow that made it feel even deeper. For the next few days, Clara stayed in the cabin, helping where she could. She cleaned, cooked small meals, and mended torn shirts she found stacked on a chair. She needed to keep busy. Doing something, anything, kept her from thinking too much about what had happened. Every time she remembered that man's words, "too old," a small ache rose in her chest. But then she'd see Sam walking across the yard, steady as ever, and something about his calmness soothed that ache. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't ask about his. Their conversations were simple, about the weather, the cattle, the small chores that made up each day. But underneath, there was something growing. Not romance, not yet, but a quiet trust. One afternoon, as the sun burned high, she found him fixing a fence post. She brought him water and a towel. "You work too hard," she said. He wiped his brow and looked up. "Work's all I've got, can't let it fall apart." "Don't you get lonely?" she asked. He paused, eyes drifting to the open land. "Every day," he said finally, "but you get used to it. Or maybe you just stop noticing." Something in his voice cracked a little on that last word. Clara felt a strange tug in her chest. She sat on the fence nearby, watching him drive the hammer into the wood. "I don't think people are made to be alone," she said. He gave a half smile. "Maybe not. But sometimes life doesn't give you much of a say." The wind picked up, tugging at her hair. "Maybe," she whispered, "sometimes we give up too soon." He looked at her again, and this time there was no distance in his eyes. Just silence and understanding. That evening the two of them ate dinner together on the porch, beans, bread, and coffee. The air smelled of rain. She watched the clouds roll in, gray and heavy, and felt something unfamiliar, a sense of peace. Sam sat beside her, his hat resting on the table. "You miss the city?" he asked suddenly. Clara thought about it. The noise, the smoke, the endless rush of people who never looked you in the eye. "No," she said softly. "There wasn't much left there for me." He nodded. "Then maybe you were meant to come here." The rain began, slow at first, then steady. They stayed seated, watching it fall over the fields. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Days turned into weeks. Clara started baking for him, leaving bread on his porch each morning. He'd return the favor in his own way. A new kettle left by her stove, a basket of eggs at her door. They never said much about it, but both noticed. The gestures built a rhythm, quiet but sure. One night, after fixing a broken window in her cabin, Sam lingered by the door. "You could stay, you know," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Not just for the night, for as long as you need." Clara's hands tightened on the edge of her shawl. "And what would people say?" she asked. He shrugged. "People always say something. Doesn't mean they're right." She looked at him then, really looked, the lines on his face, the steadiness in his voice, the way he said things not to charm but to mean them. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you've got a good heart," he replied, And I know you deserve better than what you were given." Her throat tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she managed, "You don't owe me anything." He stepped closer, not too close, just enough that his voice felt softer. "Maybe not, but I'd like to, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air like a quiet promise. She didn't answer right away. She just looked out the window where the rain had started again, tapping softly on the roof. She thought of the train, the man who had turned his back, the empty road she'd walked that night. And then she thought of Sam, steady, patient, kind without reason. She didn't know what the next day would bring. But for the first time in a long while, the future didn't scare her. It felt open, like the wide sky over the ranch. Uncertain, yes, but full of light waiting to break through. The air was crisp the next morning, carrying the scent of rain and wild sage. The ground still glistened from the night's storm, and the sky stretched pale and clean, as if the whole world had been washed. Clara stepped outside with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Sam was already awake, as always, leading a horse from the barn. He moved with the calm rhythm she had come to recognize, slow, careful, but strong. Every motion had a purpose. She admired that about him. He didn't waste words or energy. He simply did what needed to be done. He noticed her by the fence and tipped his hat. "Mornin', Clara." "Morning," she said softly, smiling. "You never rest, do you?" he chuckled. "Ranch don't run itself. Storm knocked down a gate. Gotta fix it before the cattle find freedom." She walked closer, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "Can I help?" He looked at her, considering. "You sure ain't light work." "I'm stronger than I look," she said, a teasing glint in her eyes. He grinned then, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "All right, let's see about that." Together they carried wooden planks down the path, the grass brushing against their legs. The sun climbed higher, and the land around them began to hum with life, crickets, birds, the distant lowing of cattle. Sam worked steadily, showing her how to hold the nails, how to angle the hammer so it didn't slip. She wasn't perfect, but she learned fast. Each swing of the hammer made her feel useful again, grounded in a way she hadn't felt for years. After a while they paused for water. Sam leaned against the post, watching her wipe sweat from her brow. "You pick things up quick," he said. She laughed softly. "I've had a lot of practice fixing broken things." His expression shifted, something deeper flickering there. "I believe that," he said quietly. They stood there, the wind brushing against them, carrying the scent of pine and earth. It wasn't awkward, just still, peaceful. Then, from the distance, the sound of wheels approached. A wagon rolled up the road toward the ranch. Clara shaded her eyes, and her heart gave a sharp twist. Sitting on that wagon was the man who had once turned her away. He jumped down before the horse even stopped, his boots crunching on the dirt. "Clara," he called, voice sharp. Sam straightened, stepping slightly closer to her. "You know him?" She nodded slowly, her stomach tightening. "I did." The man's face was red from the sun, or maybe from anger. "You didn't tell me you were staying here," he said, glaring at Sam, then at her. "You were supposed to be on the next train home." Clara's voice trembled, but she held her ground. "I had nowhere to go," he sneered. "You could have asked me for help." Her chest tightened. "You sent me away, you said I was too old." He looked away for a second, embarrassed, then shrugged. "I might have spoken too quick. Thought about it after you left. You're not terrible. I could still take you in, maybe. Wouldn't be right, leaving a woman stranded." Sam's jaw clenched. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to grow heavier. "You had your chance," he said quietly. The man turned to him, scoffing. "This your business, cowboy?" Sam didn't raise his voice. "It is now." Something about his calm tone made the other man falter. He looked between them, frowning. "You two got some kind of arrangement." Clara felt her face flush, but before she could speak, Sam stepped forward, eyes steady. "She's under my roof. That's all the arrangement that matters." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just claim her?" Sam took another step closer, his voice low. "No, but I can treat her better than you ever would." For a long moment no one spoke. The wind whistled through the grass. The man shifted, realizing he'd lost whatever control he thought he had. He spat on the ground, muttered something under his breath, and climbed back onto his wagon. "You'll regret this." he said to Clara, though his tone held more wounded pride than real threat. Don't come begging later. She said nothing. She just stood there, watching him leave until the wagon disappeared behind the hills. When the sound finally faded, she exhaled shakily. I didn't expect him to come back. Sam relaxed his shoulders, his hands finally unclenching. Some men don't like being told no, even when they were the first to say it. Clara turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, you didn't have to step in. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze softening. Didn't have to, no, but I wanted to. Something shifted between them then, something unspoken but real. It wasn't about protection or pity. It was about recognition. Two people who had both known loneliness and disappointment, now standing together in the same light. They walked back to the barn in silence, but the silence felt different now, warmer, fuller. Inside, Sam picked up a broken halter, pretending to busy himself. Clara lingered by the doorway. He'll tell people, she said quietly. He'll twist the story. Let him, Sam replied. People already talk. Let 'em wear out their tongues. She smiled faintly, watching him. You really don't care what they think, do you? He shrugged. I used to. Then I realized folks' opinions don't keep you warm at night. She laughed softly. No, they don't. That night the sky was clear again, full of stars. Clara sat outside her cabin, thinking about everything that had happened. Sam joined her, sitting a few feet away, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and they drank in silence. After a while she said, You didn't flinch once back there, not even when he raised his voice. Sam chuckled quietly. Seen worse than loud men with small pride. She smiled at that. You're different from most people I've met. He looked at her sideways. Different good or different bad? Good, she said simply. You listen. He took a slow sip, then said, When you spend enough time alone, you learn how to listen. To the wind, to the horses, to your own thoughts. Sometimes that's harder than fixing fences. She watched the steam rise from her cup, twisting up into the starlight. You must have been lonely before, she said softly. He didn't answer right away. Still am some days, he admitted, but not so much lately. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. The world around them was quiet except for the crickets and the soft rustle of grass. It was in that silence, that fragile calm, that something new began to bloom, quiet and steady, like the first light of dawn. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Clara woke early, just as the first light touched the horizon, and joined Sam outside. He was always there before her, already at work, his silhouette moving steady through the mist. The ranch came alive around them. The soft snorts of horses, the creak of barn doors, the low hum of a life built on quiet effort. Clara found herself drawn to it all, the simplicity, the honesty. No crowds, no gossip, no pitying eyes. Just the sound of wind, work, and the occasional murmur of conversation that felt real. She began to help more, insisting on it despite Sam's gentle protests. You don't have to do this, he'd tell her. But she always smiled and said, I need to. It gave her purpose, something she hadn't felt in years. She cooked, washed, and learned the rhythm of ranch life as though she'd been born to it. And Sam, though he tried to act indifferent, couldn't hide the small grin he'd get whenever she surprised him with a warm meal after a long day, or when she fixed something before he even asked. In the evenings, when the work was done, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun fade behind the hills. Some nights they talked, other nights they didn't. The silence between them was never uncomfortable. It carried meaning, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. One evening, as the air turned cool, Sam handed her a small wooden box. Found this while cleaning the shed, he said. Inside was a pair of earrings, old but still shining faintly in the light. They belonged to my mother, he said quietly. She wore 'em every Sunday. Clara looked at him, unsure what to say. They're beautiful, she whispered. He nodded. Thought maybe you'd like 'em. You don't have to, of course. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them. No one's given me something like this in a long time, she said. Sam looked down, his voice low. Guess it was about time someone did. She smiled. not wide or forced, but the kind of smile that reaches the heart and stays there. A few days later, the world reminded them that peace never stays untouched for long. Clara had gone into town for supplies, flour, coffee, a bit of fabric for curtains. It had been months since she'd last walked those dusty streets. Heads turned as she passed. Some faces were familiar from her first arrival, the day she'd been left alone at the station. Whispers followed her like shadows. "Ain't that the woman who got sent back?" one voice said behind her. "The one the rancher took in," another added. She kept walking, keeping her chin high, but inside, each word scraped against the walls of her chest. At the store, the shopkeeper smiled politely, but even he couldn't hide the curious glance. She paid, gathered her things, and hurried back to the wagon. When she returned to the ranch, Sam noticed her silence immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked, lifting the sacks of flour from the wagon. "Fine," she said quickly, but her voice was tight. He didn't push. He knew when not to, but that night as they sat by the fire she finally spoke. "People talk," she said softly. He glanced at her, calm as ever. "They always do. They think I shouldn't be here," she went on, "that I'm living off your kindness." Sam's jaw tightened slightly. "You've earned your place here. You work harder than most men I know." "It's not that," she said, shaking her head. They think it's wrong that I stayed after being turned away." He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You didn't stay because you were desperate, Clara. You stayed because you belong." Her eyes met his. "Do you really think that?" "I know it," he said simply. The firelight flickered between them, casting soft shadows on their faces. The world outside was dark, but in that small space, everything felt warm and safe. She wanted to believe him, to believe that what they were building here was real and unshakable. Weeks passed, and the whispers faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of their days. They worked side by side, laughter becoming more common, silence more comfortable. When Sam hurt his hand one morning fixing a plow, Clara rushed over, scolding him gently as she wrapped his palm. "You're worse than a stubborn mule," she said. He smirked. "Takes one to know one." She rolled her eyes but couldn't help laughing. Their laughter echoed across the quiet field, startling a few birds into flight. It was a small moment, but it carried more joy than she'd felt in years. As summer ripened, the land turned golden, and with it, something between them deepened. Sam had never been a man of many words, but his actions spoke for him. He built her a small garden beside the cabin, planting seeds with careful hands. "Figured you might like color out here," he said. She tended to it daily, watching as green shoots broke through the soil, fragile yet determined. One evening, as they stood by the garden, the sky glowing orange and pink, Clara said softly, "I used to think love was supposed to find you when you were young and pretty." Sam turned to her. "And now? Now I think it finds you when you've lived enough to understand what it really means." He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "Then I reckon it found us right on time." Her heart tightened, not from pain, but from the quiet realization of what he'd just said. Neither of them needed to name it, not yet. It was there, in the shared work, the late-night talks, the way he looked at her like she was the first sunrise after a long winter. That night, the stars burned brighter than usual. Clara stood outside long after Sam went to bed, the cool wind brushing her hair. She thought of how far she'd come, from a woman left behind at a train station to someone who finally felt seen. The loneliness that once wrapped around her like a heavy coat had begun to fall away. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of Sam's voice humming a tune from the porch. It was off-key, slow and rough, but it made her smile. She didn't call out to him. She didn't need to. The quiet between them said enough, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of meaning. The kind that said, without words, that maybe they were no longer two people searching for a place to belong. Maybe, just maybe, they had already found it. The first chill of autumn crept over the hills, soft and slow, painting the mornings in mist and gold. The ranch changed with the season, longer shadows, sharper winds, and the faint scent of wood smoke curling from the chimney. Clara loved those early hours most. She'd wrap herself in her shawl and watch the world wake up, coffee in hand, the steam curling against her face. The quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt full, like the land itself was breathing beside her. Inside, Sam was fixing the latch on the door, muttering under his breath as the metal refused to sit right. He'd never admit it, but she'd learned that small things like this could test his patience faster than a wild horse. She leaned on the frame, smiling. "You're losing that fight," she teased. He glanced up, his expression half a scowl, half a grin. "Door started this fight, not me," she laughed. "Well, it's winning." He set the latch down with a sigh and wiped his hands. "You always got something to say, don't you?" "Someone has to keep you humble," she replied, crossing her arms. He stepped closer, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You've been doing a fine job of that." Their eyes met, and for a moment the room went still. The air between them felt charged but not uncomfortable, just alive. Then, as if sensing he'd lingered too long, Sam looked away, grabbing his hat. "I'll check the horses." When he left, Clara stayed by the window, watching him walk toward the barn. There was something about the way he moved, steady, unhurried, that made her chest tighten in ways she couldn't quite explain. She'd told herself for weeks that this was temporary, that she'd find her own place eventually. But each passing day made that harder to believe. Each small kindness, each shared silence had begun to carve a space for her here, deep and unshakable. That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the north, sudden and fierce. The sky darkened and the wind howled across the fields. Sam rushed to bring the animals inside while Clara secured the windows and doors. The rain hit hard, drumming on the roof like 1,000 hands. When he finally came back in, drenched to the bone, she hurried toward him with a towel. "You're soaked," she said, fussing like she hadn't meant to. He chuckled, water dripping from his hat. "Storm didn't give me a choice." She handed him the towel, shaking her head. "You'll catch cold if you don't change." "Yes, ma'am," he said playfully, his tone warm. When he came back, clean and dry, the storm had settled into a steady rhythm outside. They sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket of soft orange light. The sound of thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Clara stitched a tear in her shawl while Sam sipped coffee beside her. "You ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The life before all this, the city, the noise, people everywhere." She thought about it for a long moment. "I used to think I'd die without it. The noise made me feel less alone. But now I think I was just hiding in it." He nodded slowly. "I know what that's like." They fell quiet again. The fire crackled. Every so often the wind would push against the walls, but inside everything felt safe. After a while she said softly, "When I first came here I thought I was cursed, like I'd used up all my chances." Sam set his cup down. "You weren't cursed. You were just waiting for someone to notice." Her needle paused mid-stitch. "And you did." He met her eyes, his voice low. "Couldn't help it." Something in the way he said it made her heart stutter. The world outside could have vanished right then, and she wouldn't have noticed. They stayed like that for a moment, no words, no movement. Just two lives that had quietly found their way to each other through everything that should have kept them apart. Later that week, the air turned colder still. Frost began to gather on the windows each morning. Clara spent her days baking, sewing, preparing for the winter ahead. Sam cut wood until his hands blistered. They worked side by side like they always had, but something in their rhythm had changed. There was a gentleness now, a kind of awareness. One morning she found a small bunch of wildflowers left on her windowsill. They were unevenly tied with twine, petals slightly wilted, but she smiled the moment she saw them. Sam never mentioned them and she didn't ask. She just put them in a jar by the table where the sunlight could touch them. That night as the sun went down and the cold crept in, Sam came by the cabin. He stood at the door, hat in hand. "Can I come in?" he asked. "You don't have to ask," she said softly. He stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. The air felt warmer somehow, even though the fire hadn't been lit yet. "I've been thinking," he began, voice low, "about what you said before, how people talk." She nodded slowly. "They still will." "Let 'em," he said. "I'm tired of living like what other folks say matters more than what's true." Her breath caught. "What are you saying, Sam?" He looked at her then, steady and unflinching. "I'm saying you're not here because of pity. You're here because I want you here. Because when I wake up and see your light in the cabin, the day feels different. Better. I ain't good with fancy words, Clara, but if you'd let me, I'd spend the rest of my life trying to make sure you never feel unwanted again." The world went quiet except for the soft crack of wood shifting in the stove. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. She took a step closer, then another. Her eyes shimmered with something between disbelief and joy. "You mean that?" He nodded once. "Every word." Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Then just be mine." Sam's breath hitched, and for the first time the calm in his eyes gave way to something raw and open. He reached out, taking her hand, rough from work, warm from the firelight. Outside, the storm had passed and the sky was clear again. Through the window, the stars shone bright, scattering their light across the fields. Sam held her close, no grand promises, no rehearsed words. Just the quiet understanding of two people who had spent their whole lives waiting for this moment. Proof that even the hearts once cast aside could still find home. And in the stillness of that night, as the wind whispered through the grass and the world turned softly toward winter, there was no need for anything more. Just two souls, steady and sure, finally where they were meant to be.